Welcome back. In this video lesson we want to look at some of the sliders under the Basic tab in the control panel. All of these sliders are used to help control colour and tones within your photograph. Now for the purposes of this lesson I've set up this file which has a black and white photograph of this Rwandan girl I took when I was in Rwanda, and over here this black to white gradient represents all the tones in that image. During the course of the lesson, just keep an eye on this histogram up here, and it helps explain what each of these sliders is doing. Now, this end of the histogram represents all the dark tones in the image, and this other end represents all the white and highlight tones in the image. Obviously, the midtones are represented by the middle of the graph right here. When you first open up the Basic tab, you're confronted with all these sliders. And we'll go through these one by one. But the first two are to do with setting the white balance. Now, white balance is important in colour photography, but it's not really applicable to black and white photography. So we'll skip those and leave that for another lesson. The first slider is the exposure slider. And if I click and drag this to the left, you'll see that most of the tones in my image are getting darker. And if I click and drag this to my right, you can see that most of the tones in my image are getting brighter. This is because the exposure slider affects nearly all the tones within your image. Now the other sliders, by comparison, are targeting specific parts of the tonal range. For example, the next slider down, the recovery slider, targets the lighter tones towards the bright white end of the spectrum. If I click and drag this to my right, you can see that these are becoming darker, while the other tones up this end are relatively unchanged. You can reset any slider back to its default value by double-clicking on its triangle. So I'm going to do that now to reset the exposure slider, and double-click here to reset that recovery slider back to 0. The next slider is called the full light, and as the name would suggest, it's adding light into these dark areas, the 3/4 tones. When I click and drag, it'll make these lighter, and as I do so you can see how that affects our image. I'll just take this full light down a little bit, and notice even at this setting the blacks have become washed out. So often a good idea is to use the slider called the blacks slider to increase the density of the darkest tones. And these two sliders often work in hand. People find that when they use the full light slider, they often need to compensate their dark tones by using the black slider. So these two often go together. I'll just reset these by double-clicking and setting them back to 0. The next slider is called the brightness slider. As you might expect, it controls the brightness in the image. If I slide it to my left, the image gets darker, and if I slide it to my right, the image gets brighter. Now, it may appear to be doing the same thing as the exposure slider, but in actual fact it's targeting just the quarter tones. Other tones are affected, but it's mostly changing around this level here. I'll slide it so you can see how that's working. I'll just reset that back to 0. The last slider is the contrast slider. Now the contrast slider works by increasing the contrast, so it pushes the 3/4 tones into the shadows and the quarter tones into the highlights, increasing the contrast or decreasing the contrast. To increase the contrast, click and drag this slider to the right. You can see the image of this Rwandan girl has become more contrasty, and alternatively, click and drag it to the left to even out the tonal range. The next 3 sliders, clarity, vibrance and saturation, are all to do with colour, so we don't need to worry about those in this lesson. Now, what we've covered is fairly straightforward when it comes to black and white photography, but it does get a little more confusing when we apply that to colour images. So we'll cover that in the next lesson.